Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for our first ARI Seminar of 2024, using spatial information to protect our environment. I'm Tess McLaren, I'm the Acting Science Manager of Knowledge's Behaviour and Science Impact, and I'll be the MC for the seminar today. We'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we're all meeting. I'm on the lands of Wurundjeri here in Rosanna and pay respect to their elders past and present, and any First Nations people joining us today. Today, we're going to dive into the real-world applications of spatial data modelling and its environmental management and policy impact, followed by a look at our Victorian Biodiversity Atlas and the role we can all play in contributing to this incredibly valuable data set. To start us off, we're super lucky to be joined by Dr Emma Hudgins from the University of Melbourne. Emma has recently moved across from Canada, where she has worked on modelling invasive species, dispersal, and spatial prioritisation. Welcome, Emma. I'll throw to you.
Thanks very much, Tess, and thank you all for being here. This is by far the most people I've ever spoken to, so thanks for joining today. As Tess said, I'm going to be talking about the work that I did during my postdoc and how I intend to use that work moving forward now that I'm at Melbourne Uni, and hoping to partner with folks across levels of government to do so. I'd like to acknowledge my work was done on the traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation, and I too am now speaking to you on the lands of the Wurundjeri people and like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So today I'm going to be discussing work on forest pest invasions, primarily informed by large-scale spatial data. So it ties really nicely into Bev's talk later. In order to use some of these tools, you need to collect that large-scale spatial data and do so consistently. And even a little bit of data in the present time can help you recast what happened in the past to figure out what to do for the future. So I'm going to be talking about three different components today. The first of which is a bit of a backstory on a business as usual case for how impactful invasive forest pests are expected to be in the next 30 years in the United States. And then I'll go over how I used those models of business as usual and change them around under different management scenarios to figure out the best management decisions to take to limit those impacts moving forward for the most impactful invader, that's the emerald ash borer. And then I'll finish off by talking briefly about how I might extend some of this work in Australia and what I need to do for that to work. So this work pertains to United States invasive forest pests. So these are economically impactful species that harm forests and forest products. It's a nice overlap of both being economically and ecologically impactful in this case, which is not always the case with invasive species. But you'll see that the most invasive forest pests are in the Northeast and along the west coast of the US. And that's a really good initial indication that human activity is driving their distribution, because that's also where the most income is and where the most people are and where the most travel is happening to. And the pattern is actually replicated across the Canadian border, where most of the pests are present along the southern border, which is also where most of the people are. You might be wondering why, if I'm Canadian, I did all my work on US forest data. It's because Canadian forest data does not exist to the same capacity, and there's really good forest inventory data for the US that's not really present in Canada. Similarly, the invasive species records in Canada are not as complete in terms of forest pests, at least. So forest pests in North America span 4 different what are known as feeding guilds based on the way that they kill their host species. So the top left here are the wood-boring pests, and this includes emerald ash borer, which is shown here. It's a jewel beetle, and it's very jewel-like in its appearance. So they bore holes into the wood and phloem of trees and basically cut off the circulation of the tree so sap can't flow further up the tree, which is really deadly for the tree. Basically, it cuts off their circulation, so they're going to be the most impactful of the group. Defoliators, like the spongy moth on the top right, feed on the leaves, and most trees can withstand a good amount of defoliation without dying. The bottom left are sap feeders, so these include adelgid type species. This is the balsam woolly adelgid. And the bottom right are pathogens. So this is a completely different branch of the evolutionary tree. But what you'll see is that they're predominantly moving in the same way, even though they're really unrelated from one another. And that's because the thing that's moving them is not themselves, but people. And I should mention that for all these species, we really didn't have historical spread information. So we didn't know year to year where they were present, except for 3 or 4 of them. So my goal in my PhD, which is when I started this work, was to do a backcast and recast where these species had probably spread from in order to get to where they are today. I was particularly interested in impacts to urban trees because this is where economically we knew most of the impacts of forest pests were going to be felt, and urban tree health impacts the majority of people worldwide because most people live in cities, and urban trees are really important for urban well-being, especially under climate change, where they're going to be really important for shade and combating that urban heat island effect. And they're also important for mental health benefits, as I'm sure we learned during the lockdowns. So one reason why forest pest damage is so impactful to urban trees is that they're often planted in really huge monocultures, especially in North America, where ash trees were planted almost exclusively across cities. So I should mention that ash trees in North America are not related to mountain ash trees. They're completely different. They're in the olive family. And this is a tree before and after, a street of trees before and after emerald ash borer has gone through. It causes 95% mortality in 5 to 10 years. And so it can really turn a community upside down in terms of their ability to mitigate heat. So I'll start by giving an overview of this recent economic analysis I did for street tree mortality. And this was done in partnership with the United States Forest Service researchers, Mark Ambrose and Frank Koch, who had spent over a decade compiling individual municipal data sets for different communities across the US to figure out which types of street trees they had been planting. And that's really necessary because otherwise this information is kept entirely disparately across different communities, and it's harder to make these broad scale forecasts with them. And I was supervised by Brian Leung, who's my PhD supervisor at McGill University. So this analysis combined 3 subcomponents to try to figure out those impact trajectories. The first of which was, as I mentioned, those street tree distributions, which are going to look quite different from natural tree distributions because there are other motivations for planting trees apart from their habitat suitability. There's a lot of social factors that predict which trees are located where. The second was a model of insect distributions, and that was generated from the spread forecast that I mentioned earlier, trying to create general pictures of insect spread because of the role of humans. And then this last layer was understanding, given that insects and trees were expected to interact in the future, how many of those interactions would lead to tree death, causing the removal and replacement of the street tree. And that's where I got those cost estimates, really just on the removal and replacement of street trees. So as I mentioned, I worked with this urban tree inventory database, which was a lot of work for Frank and Mark and took over 10 years. They amassed about 600 communities. I will say the United States has a lot more populous places than Australia overall, but there's roughly close to 30,000 that we had to extrapolate to from this 600. And we do have some quite serious gaps in terms of the urban tree inventories, so it's probably important to take estimates in these areas with a grain of salt, but that's also not where there are as many trees. A lot of that is desert. So we had to extrapolate based on those community level predictors to understand the types of trees and also the sizes of the trees in each community, because that's going to impact how costly they are to remove and replace. So in the end, we ended up with this map of street tree abundance. I'm just showing it overall here, but it was broken down by tree genus and tree size. The next layer, as I mentioned, was that pest spread model. And so we wanted to create a single model that could be applied for all pest species because we didn't have enough single pest information. So we didn't have their historical spread trajectories. So we started from the estimation that all pests were spreading in broadly the same way, according to spatial factors. And to do this, I used simulation models where we started off each pest in the center of their host range, or in some cases in our initial record of where they were first introduced. But even that information was not available for all pests, especially the ones first introduced over 100 years ago. We then used equations that allowed them to grow and disperse up until the present date, until they reached their present day distribution, and checked this present day distribution against the real distribution and fit models such that we were able to match these simulated and true distributions as closely as possible. And to do this, we tested a combination of different factors, either related to pest traits, tree traits in each site, and human traits in each site. And we actually found that the pest traits beyond where their host trees were found were not that important. And really what mattered was the human population in source and destination locations and how many trees there were. Overall, this allowed me to create this map from 1800 to today of how pests were spreading across the US. You'll notice a glaring hole where Arkansas didn't give me their data, but you can see that really intense aggregation in the Northeast in recent years. So putting that together with the street tree abundance, we have this map of future insect establishment, and then that allows us to get these future interactions between street trees and pests. And then as a final layer, I had to add mortality estimates, which were also quite coarse from the literature. It's hard to know how many trees are going to die after being exposed to a certain number of pests. We use some Bayesian approaches to try to estimate the uncertainty around this, assuming that most pests are actually not going to be that impactful, but then we're going to have a few that are super impactful, like emerald ash borer. And thankfully, those are the ones that we have better mortality estimates for. So putting all of this together, I predicted that 1.5 million street trees would die in the next 30 years, and that this would cost $31 million US per year just to remove and replace dead and dying street trees. I should mention that street trees are roughly 2% of all trees in cities. So this estimate could be 1 to 2 orders of magnitude larger if we account for all urban trees and assume that they would also get managed in the same way. But street trees are typically the ones that get removed and replaced most readily because they're the biggest threat to people and they're all managed by local governments typically. So the spatial distribution of these impacts was also quite clustered, where 94% of the impact was in 23% of communities. I should also mention that emerald ash borer was the source of 90% of all impacts in these estimates. So this is where we found the greatest impacts. They were sort of as expected for the most part along the leading edge of the existing emerald ash borer distribution. But what was really interesting and devastating was that we also predicted this jump to the West Coast that emerald ash borer did do. It reached Oregon, so not quite Seattle, but it reached Oregon in 2021. And we're expecting that if it continues to spread along the West Coast, and this is important for the implications, that it could reach Seattle, which has a lot of ash trees and cause really big impacts. So just to sum up that section, future US street tree impacts will largely be due to emerald ash borer, and we're going to see most of those impacts in the Midwest and Northeast. And all of these different sort of incomplete data sources can be combined in ways that allow us to make these impact predictions, and you'll see later how they get used to inform management. So during my postdoc, I worked on transforming these models from more business as usual to more prescriptive. How do we change that business as usual case to limit impacts? And I was most interested in emerald ash borer because it was causing most of the impacts. And here I'm showing it emerging from an ash tree. They create these typical D-shaped exit holes. You don't typically see them actually emerging, but those holes are a good indication, or if there's a spike in woodpecker activity. So I had a prediction of where EAB or emerald ash borer was going to be. I had a prediction of where street trees are, and I wanted to change the management actions such that they changed future emerald ash borer densities. And that involved modeling the spread and the population growth of emerald ash borer in the presence or absence of management in each site. I was also interested in this because emerald ash borer at the federal level in the US was recently deregulated for limiting its movement. So the quarantine regions were removed, thereby allowing untreated wood to move outside of this quarantine region. And instead of allowing for that quarantine to continue, the federal government started funding biological control releases of parasitoid wasps that lay their eggs in the eggs or larvae of emerald ash borer and are thought to be a way to keep ash trees alive by reducing emerald ash borer population densities. But I was curious because there hadn't actually been a counterfactual of this, of how much would spread have been happening in the absence of this quarantine in the past. and how effective we expect biological control to be to keep limiting those impacts. So I set up my model to allow quarantines to alter those dispersal equations and biological control to alter population densities of the pests in each cell in order to check across a range of different hypothetical effectivenesses how best these two strategies should be combined and how much worse or better we would be off if we just use one versus another. This was a bit complex because the parasitoid insects also spread, and that's part of their strategy, is that they're released so that they can establish everywhere where emerald ash borer is well established and then spread themselves. So we had to incorporate this as well. But what we found, and this is a bit of a complex figure, is that across different efficiency scenarios, so we tried to put reasonable bounds on how effective quarantines could be and how effective biological control could be. Across different levels of efficiency, we always found fewer exposed ash trees when we relied on a combination of biological control and quarantines versus only relying on biological control. So that's the red shapes up top. And in the worst case scenario, up to 1 million additional street trees would die if we relied only on biological control versus a combination of these two approaches. And this would save roughly $600 million as well. Just in terms of street trees, like I mentioned, which again, only 2% of all trees. We were also able to make some spatial recommendations for where the effort should be located, where we should start moving some effort over to the West Coast, which importantly, I should mention, does not currently have anything. Washington State does not currently have any measures against emerald ash borer movement, and concentrate a lot of it more in high density urban population centers rather than keeping it all around that quarantine boundary. So just to recap this section, without being tested with these models, it can be easy to make decisions around management that don't appear to align with the best evidence that we have. And it's important to test the cost of doing nothing and to make a more informed decision in light of that. And also, just using these optimizations can lead to really big cost and conservation benefits. So I'd like to end off briefly with a few ideas for how I might apply similar methods to Australia. And the first component is thinking instead of invasive species spread, thinking about native species spread in response to climate change, so range shifting trees in response to climate change. Thinking about how to apply these types of optimizations to Australian street trees, including at the local level and at the national level, and a couple other decision-based projects looking at feed insects that are currently being reared for animal production and cooperation between neighboring states or provinces. So I've done a bit of work on building a similar model that builds off of invasive species spread, but instead looks at tree seed dispersal under climate change. And this was particularly interesting in Canada because a lot of the trees are moving northward. And actually the cost of protecting land is cheaper the further north you go, because most of the high urban population areas are in the south. So it's actually potentially beneficial to protect a larger area of land further north if we want to accommodate that connectivity for trees that are moving northward. So that's something I'm exploring in Canada and would love to explore in Australia as well. So I've put in an ARC-DECRA and a discovery project proposal on this topic in various ways, one of them looking at uncertainty and value of information, and one of them just looking more so at that decision context. But there's a lot I need to know locally about Australian trees in order to make this a reasonable problem in this case. At the local level, I'm interested in just informing the city of Melbourne and other municipalities about the risks that their current urban planting strategies might be posing because we have forecasts or we have information about the likely pests reaching these cities, and we can maybe make some basic models about how they're going to spread throughout the urban tree population and allow that to be added into the types of things they're thinking about for preserving their urban canopy, because I know they've got some targets they're trying to meet. I'm also interested at the country scale in understanding whether there are similar trade-offs to be made between preventing dispersal versus monitoring, limiting local populations. So thinking about those quarantines versus biological control within the Australian context. And some species that I'm thinking about working on are myrtle rust and Phytophthora dieback. These are species that are already established, and we might want to be slowing their spread. I know there's a lot of emphasis on more preventative actions, but I'm interested in the species that we've often given up on because they seem to be here to stay. But there's a lot of communities that could still be at the urban tree level really heavily impacted, and allowing them time to respond and replant is still a huge benefit. In terms of cooperation, I'm currently working with the Canadian Forest Service on this beetle, which is mountain pine beetle. And it's actually, I think, on a risk list for Australia for pine plantations. But in Canada, it's a species that's behaving almost like an invader, even though it's native, and it's moving eastward under climate change. And so we're currently using game theory approaches to figure out how much this province to the east should be transferring over to this province to the west to ensure beneficial outcomes for both of them. Because it might not seem like the eastern province should be paying for limiting the spread, but it's actually in their best interest in the long term. So I'm interested in analogous systems in Australia, and we'll be happy to chat about those. And then finally, this project looking at the insect feed industry and understanding what sort of contamination risks exist, and if we can figure out an optimal distribution of surveillance for contamination or escape of these insects. My understanding is black soldier flies are currently escaping, but there haven't been any major issues flagged. But just understanding how, similar to other livestock diseases, there could be diseases of insects reared for production that could have huge economic implications and also potentially spill over to native biodiversity. So that's it for me. I hope some of this work was interesting for you and that you can see ways that this could be used in Australia, and would love to take your feedback on that. And thanks to all of my past lab mates and partners at the Canadian and US government. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Emma. That was awesome and super interesting and very applicable, as you said, to the Australian context. I think we've already got a couple of questions in the chat, but I've got some questions myself. So if anyone has questions, pop them in the chat, and Penny will read them out shortly. So we're curious about what's the US doing in light of your findings? Do you know?
Yeah, so I'm going to know a little bit more towards the end of the month, because they're having a Western states and Canadian provinces meeting to kind of figure out a path forward. But as far as I know right now, because the federal regulations have been removed for Emerald Ash Borer, individual states had the choice to either make their own quarantine zones or abandon the quarantine or maintain a state level one they already had. So it's super variable. And what they consider to be a quarantine zone also varies, where the type of wood treatment they're doing is variable. But like I said, Washington isn't doing anything, and they're a situation where the pest is already in Oregon, and it's very close to Washington, and we're projecting these really big losses. So that's an area where I'm really hoping to have some influence and make them think a little bit more about quarantines.
Yeah. And another question I have is, how might you have to alter some of your past models to suit the Australian context?
Yeah, so some of that is still a bit of an open question in terms of the availability of broad-scale forest inventory data, both natural forests and native forests. A lot of the pests are going to be quite different. They're going to be eucalypt pests, and the road network in Australia also has a completely different shape in terms of being not very well distributed through the middle of the country. And so, I mean, it's a matter of understanding what those base layers are and the outcomes being quite different, but the basic structure of the models, I think, should flow over fairly seamlessly to Australia.
Awesome. Penny, I might hand to you because we've got a couple of questions in the chat that I think would be good to.
Yeah, we've just got two. So the first one is, does the model recognise the difference in spread of the pests in areas where a variety of trees are planted compared to monocultures?
Right. So The model does recognize areas where the host density is higher and lower. And so it will spread, basically has like an attractiveness component for different destinations. And so different destinations that have more of the host, it can spread faster to them. Similarly, it can spread slower or faster out of sites based on how well that would predict future spread. So monocultures definitely have an impact on spread rates in the model and in real life.
Great, thank you. And there's one more. How do you think biocontrol of EAB would perform if it were used as part of an integrated pest management program rather than as a standalone control method?
That's a really good question. And I don't want the outcome of this talk to be seen as an anti-biocontrol message. It's more that biocontrol alone cannot slow the spread of emerald ash borer. And many people who work in biocontrol would tell you that that wasn't ever the goal of biocontrol. It was to save ash species because they're really at risk of functional extirpation, particularly black ash, which is super important for Indigenous basket making in the Great Lakes region and Eastern Canada. But I think integrating it within an IPM context is definitely the best way forward, because even if we're slowing the spread, the capacity for us to fully exclude EAB from regions of North America is still unclear. And so to allow those areas where we have seen that 95% mortality to bounce back and have some component of resistant ash, particularly in North America where ash are native, I think is really important. So I think it's very useful locally for population control and for keeping ash trees alive.
Fantastic. That's all from the chat.
Awesome. Well, I think we might move on to our next presentation now. Thank you so much, Emma. That was awesome. And we're moving on to a topic that's highly relevant to what Emma's just spoken about. By popular request, we've got Bev Yen from DEECA. A lot of people from the division have been really keen to hear some more about the Victorian Biodiversity Atlas. So here we have Bev, and Bev's been working on the Atlas for the past 5 years and is committed to robust data processes that ingest and store high quality survey data and the publication of spatial data sets that are used in modelling and research and public land management. So super relevant. And yeah, over to you, Bev.
Cool, thanks very much. And thank you, Emma. That was actually a really good example of how data is used, and also when you're missing data, how you're having to extrapolate things. So that's sort of where I'm coming from as well. Hopefully my presentation will present. So I'm going to do a talk on the Victorian Biodiversity Atlas and how adding your data to the VBA can help influence land management and for the best for biodiversity. Before I start, I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land we're meeting on today. I'm presenting from the land of the Wurundjeri people, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge any traditional owners listening today. So I'm basically outline of my talk. I'm going to cover what is the VBA, what is the data used for, and what can we do to improve it, which is adding high quality data and identifying filling gaps. And there will be time for questions at the end. So what is the VBA? The VBA is a database of species observations in Victoria. It supports our legislative responsibilities, such as the FFG and the Wildlife Acts, and it feeds into multiple products, workflows, platforms that can be accessed in a number of different ways. For example, when the department conducts FFG assessments and approvals, the VBA is the data source. The VBA also contains a list of species names that is accepted by government, as well as details such as their conservation status and increasingly data on attributes such as species traits and genetic risk. The VBA is a foundational curated data source that informs government biodiversity decision making. VBA data quality. So the VBA has a minimum set of standards, which is basically who, what, where and when. with the option of adding more information, such as survey details and the amount of effort that went into finding that record, whether it was a breeding record, so forth. The location and the species are verified by experts, and if the experts have any queries, the observer will be contacted with a request for more information. Once a record is verified, we can publish it. The VBA is targeted at ecologists, that's professionals, students, and volunteer citizen scientists who know their species. So we don't offer suggestions for taxa like the iNaturalist app because our target audience doesn't need this feature. Key points to remember: ideally, before you start your data collection, ensure you record the minimum amount of information needed to create a record. Please note that we do check the site location description as well as the coordinates. And we also need to know who recorded or identified the observation. So if there are any further details or issues, we know who to follow up with. What's the VBA data used for? In order to protect biodiversity, we need to know where it is. So published data is added to our biodiversity mapping tool, NatureKit. It's also one of the data sets underpinning the species habitat models and decision support tools that are used to direct conservation investment and funding programs. Decision support tools that are used to direct conservation investment and funding programs to areas where the species will most benefit from these actions. It's used in the conservation status assessments, including the recent revision of the FFG threatened species list. It's found in tools that are used to assess biodiversity values and where to undertake additional surveys or what activities and locations to avoid in land management, fire response and forestry operations. Also in natural values checking for fuel reduction programs, pest management, survey and native vegetation permit processing. The data is used in biodiversity research, both directly for the government and for independent research institutes. It's used in reporting species trends via the newly developed Victorian Biodiversity Index, which is part of the soon-to-be-released Victorian Biodiversity Indicator Framework. Nationally, due to the standards for data, we can compile our data into national and international data sets and help species trend analysis, such as the Threatened Species Index. And obviously, like all of these things, that's why it's critical to have the best possible information, because the better the information you feed into these tools, the better the outcomes that come out of it. So this is where we need your help. How can we make the VBA better? Although what you see is an older looking app, the real engine of the VBA is the underpinning database. So we have over 10 million verified records. The screenshot you see here is a shot of what's actually Rosenberg's goanna, which was my opening slide. The small dark blue dots are the records we have of that goanna up in this area. The larger blue squares is our sort of just generalised distribution of that species. But as you can see in the little desert, we actually only have 4 records. So that doesn't really tell us about its distribution in there. So if we had more records, it could fill in the gaps quite easily and give us far more information about that particular species. Our aim is to have the best data possible feeding into all of the processes that use our data. How does data get into the VBA and what data? So basically, only curated data sets are bulk uploaded into the VBA. Herbarium records, museum specimens, and so forth. So these are records that experts have already looked at, and they can tell us that these are correct identifications and so forth. So we don't bother checking them again, we just put them in automatically. Everything else needs to go through expert review in one form or another. There are a large number of collection apps in the biodiversity domain. Some are better than others to ensure that minimum data standards are met. We do encourage users to use the best recording method for them, but we don't automatically take data from, say, the ALA or iNaturalist. One of the biggest issues with these for us is that the records are not actually associated with an individual we can identify or contact. We do encourage observers who are confident with their identification skills to upload records directly to the VBA. even if this means that data is in two places. A good data analyst should be able to identify these duplicates. Adding the data direct helps retain all the details, ensures correct taxonomy is used, and reduces the lag time for the data to appear in our public data sets. We can provide help guides for users wishing to transfer their data from iNaturalist to the VBA. And if you have other queries, please just get in contact. What makes high quality data? Survey data is better than incidental observations. Most public collection apps reduce species observations to isolated records. So this species was seen in this location on this date. Observations containing more than just these basic details, including survey effort, co-located species, and other extra detail, provide much richer data. Repeat surveys at the same site using the same method are an extremely valuable way to track change over time. The VBA also has the option to record absence data, as in I went out specifically looking for this species and it wasn't there, as well as survey effort, the amount of time spent looking, the number of observers, so forth, and also co-located species. So what else was seen at the same time in the same place? Adding data directly into the VBA. Funding agreements with DEECA or our partners, as well as the various biodiversity-related permits DEECA ministers, all mandate uploading your data into the VBA. This includes captured, translocated, specimen and sampled species. Data can be uploaded in bulk via our batch upload system. So although the VBA is a user upload system, we can help you navigate the upload process. Even if you're not obligated to upload your data, the data that's in the VBA has a big influence on land management decisions. So if you want your data to have an influence, it kind of needs to be in the VBA. You can always access your own data and edit it at any stage. And we also operate a restricted viewing system for sensitive records in the VBA, which was the small blue squares on the previous slide. Access to the unrestricted version of these data is by application to us. What do I need to record? So all of these red fields are mandatory for entering data. So we need an observer who within our system, we would have a contact email so we can follow up with things. Contributors are other people who have also been involved in the same survey, and these people have the right to edit that data as well. The date is fairly straightforward. Location is the coordinates, but also a description of the location. It's not uncommon that we might have, say, an MGA zone is wrong. So the point will plot in the west of the state instead of the east of the state. So the description helps us identify that quickly. The species needs to come from our VBA taxa list, which is a list of known Victorian native and non-native established species. So naturalised populations should be included, but garden escapees and obviously planted specimens wouldn't be, or they'd be marked as such. Sampling method, so what sort of survey you were doing, the more information you can give us there, the better. And other useful information, species count, cover abundance, extra information, was it a breeding record, was it dead, and so forth. Any information that you actually record, if there's a way of getting it into the VBA, that's really good. Gaps in the VBA data. So although we have over 10 million records in the VBA, they're not spread evenly, spatially, taxonomically, or temporally. This black and white image shows VBA fauna records across Victoria. As you can see, there are hotspots for observations, but there's also large areas with very sparsely sampled areas. The image on the right displays the mammal monitoring sites, which is used for the Threatened Species Index. These are sites that have had repeated surveys using the same method. As you can see in the northwest, there are none at all, basically. And we're also aware we have a deficit of data on private land. And this bar chart distinctly shows that we have a large bias toward bird and vascular plant data. The inset is taken from work in developing the new Victorian Biodiversity Index and shows that the density of plant survey sites is concentrated in relatively few small areas of the state, so the bits with the darker coloured backgrounds. We're currently working with the University of Melbourne to undertake a gap analysis on where gaps in our monitoring efforts across the state are. Hopefully this analysis and findings will be completed in the first half of this year and put to use. This map shows an area, this is East Gippsland, with a relatively high density of surveys, but I've split them up into decades. So on closer inspection, if you look around here, we've got a lot of blue surveys. The blue ones are from the 1980s and 1990s. So these are areas that haven't been surveyed for 30 to 40 years. And yet we know we've had an awful lot of bushfires, floods and storms go through this area since then. So what's the area look like now? We don't really know. As part of managing the impact of these gaps, we're seeking to fill the gaps with more records. And this includes uploading data that already exists but hasn't been widely shared. So this means if you've got data in your bottom of your filing cabinet, please pull it out. We can help people getting this data into the VBA. We also use habitat distribution as a way of extrapolating areas with fewer records. So new records that fall outside our modelled habitats, which are the HDMs, are also extremely valuable data which can help improve these products. Yes, and when we suddenly need the data, so this black outline is the footprint of the Bayandine fire near Beaufort last month. Inside the orange bits, you can see the HDM of the Mount Cole grevillea, which is effectively 100% in the fire zone. The purple triangles is the flurry of new records that arrived once people realised that we're about to have bulldozers creating containment lines, and then in the aftermath clearing hazardous trees and so forth. Hopefully we got this data out in time. And I mean, most of this is fairly recent data, but at the same time, you know, it's possible that some of the people who needed to know didn't get the information in time. And the other thing is next time we redo this HDM, it's going to change because you can see there's quite a few records that are not in its predicted habitat zone. So a checklist. When you go out recording data, please check that, you know, you've got the minimum standards, and if there's other things that it's easy to collect, please do so. Share the data with us. And once you upload it, like say via batch upload, it does need to be submitted. So one last step. Once it's been submitted for review, then it's in our system and we can find it without having to go searching for it. All of this data, so to make use of this excellent data set you've helped us create, these are the different ways to access it. The VBA application, you know, which is our old sort of thing, does have download limits, but it is the source of truth. So that's where we update things first. We then publish data in NatureKit. On the map, you can only see the threatened species, but you can download everything. Currently, the data is updated approximately every 6 weeks, but we're working on improving that as well. You can also download the full spatial data sets from DataShare, and access to the restricted data or bespoke downloads is available on application. Remember to check the version date or the last updated date on all published data sets, because the VBA is a dynamic database and we don't want people using stuff that was from 2 years ago. We do publish help guides and videos on our website, and when we get the time, we add new ones and update them. And any questions, this is the most important one, our email. Get in touch with us, and if we don't know the answer, we'll find it and we can certainly help you get your data in. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Bev. That was awesome and super helpful. I was going to ask some questions that I had, but there's actually a heap of really good ones in the chat that we should probably get to. Penelope, okay to
yeah,
go to those?
So in terms of data recording, so should incidental sightings be included, or is it only survey data?
We do take incidental recordings, definitely, But what we are finding is sometimes people are just putting things down as incidental when they actually did a survey. They went out and did a specific method, and we would prefer they put that specific method down. But if you only have incidentals, like, you know, if you're driving along and you see something or you snap something on a photo, absolutely give it to us. So, yes.
Oh, and that kind of leads into the second one, which is what's the preferred way of submitting data where a target species was searched for but not detected or found? So it's an absence record.
An absence record. So we would pretty much put it under as a survey method. We have targeted species, or you could do a monitoring if you went out to a particular site and you're monitoring for a particular species. Those are the two main ones because it does indicate to us what you were looking for usually. Because I'm pretty sure actually targeted survey is probably the best because I think you can put down what species you were looking for and then say it was a zero count. So a zero count is an absence, but if you put it down as an incidental record with a zero, we'd go, well, that doesn't mean anything, basically.
Great. And is there, this is just another question, is there potential in the future to incorporate eDNA sampling results into the VBA?
We are already doing that. Excellent. One step ahead. So we do have that as a method because we've had like the platypus sampling and so forth led us to develop eDNA. So it's in there as a surveyed method, and there's a couple of different sampling details depending on the type of DNA analysis you did as well. And the other thing is, as things move along, we do add, if there's a new technique that's out there that people are using, we will add new methods to record it.
Right. There's quite a few questions in the chat, so we might not get around to all of them, but do you happen to know when VBA Go is likely to get back online? It's a great tool for incidental recording.
Yes, and that's a very awkward question. So basically,
no,
that's okay. When we moved to the cloud, it broke all our links. So us moving to the cloud was part of giving us more processing power because we used to have the VBA used to crash all the time. So it doesn't crash so much now. But it's a very slow process to recreate all these links. So it's not off our radar, but we are a very small team. And so our one developer also does all the regular things to fix things when things go wrong. We're trying to develop a new batch upload system so you don't have to use our rigid templates. VBA Go is sort of integrated with that. And we're also trying to produce new ways of getting the data out. So it's not just the 3 static sort of ways of doing it. So hopefully there'll be other ways that people can access the data more easily, more efficiently. So it's all part of the big thing. But yes, we are aware that an awful lot of people would like VBA Go back online.
I think that answers another question as well, so that's good. We've got another one from Greg. AgVic is working with the ALA to record field observations of weed biocontrol agents nationally. Are introduced biocontrol agents categorised in the VBA, or could we check that these species are captured? I can repeat that if you need.
So is that these are particular taxonomic species? Some of them are in there, but possibly not all of them, depending on. But we can certainly work with AgVic to see where we've got overlap. We do have with the weeds and pests program, we have certainly introduced more species in there, like to capture the early weeds, early invader weeds. So they're not necessarily established, but if somebody's found one that's been identified as such, we'll put it in there so that if other people see it, we can get those records and let that team know that it's there. So yes, there's certainly scope to work with AgVic there.
Right, and someone's just asked, how would we go about uploading survey results in bulk?
Contact us on that email address, vba.help, but we have, it's basically an Excel template where you can enter all of your records in one hit, and then there's a function in the VBA where you can upload them. So you don't have to go through and add records one at a time, because that would be very painful.
Right. I think there's a couple of others, but we might be able to just reply to them afterwards.
Yes.
Because I feel like I'm throwing them all at you.
I've got a couple, Bev, that I had kind of pre-prepared. What's the most helpful thing we can all do when we're submitting our data to VBA Go? Oh, to VBA.
VBA. So from our point of view, it's the high quality data. So, you know, if you have conducted a survey, put it down as a survey method, but it also helps if you put that element of effort in there. So if you said, I've done whatever survey and my survey detail is an area, you actually have to put an area in there to say, like, this was a 1 kilometre site that we actually checked, or linear thing, because that effort gives us an idea of how common, how hard it is to find that detail. So there's an awful lot of uses out there that we haven't even thought of, but if we have that information in the first place, then when someone else comes back to look at the data, it gives them a lot more options for what they can analyse. So the more data we can get for each record, the better.
Can I jump in with another question, just because we've had a couple of people ask about it? Why can't iNaturalist records, which have who, what, where and when, be brought into the VBA?
So we did look at that initially. We did one big bulk move across, but there are, because obviously we don't have the ability to go and look at every single photograph. So, that's out of it. We do things in bulk. We moved a big bunch across, but we did find there were quite a lot that weren't up to scratch. So we then had to get rid of those ones. So we were finding it was taking a lot of our time to go through and sort the good from the bad. There are some really good records in there. We are in the process of trialling, but again, a bit short-staffed to get it massively under the way. But we've been talking to one guy in the field nets. So can we import all of his records in there? Especially he's an insect man, so he's got some fantastic things in there. We are finding we're having to add a lot of new taxonomy to the VBA as well, because that's an area we haven't got a lot of. So it's actually going very, very slowly. The other thing is the iNaturalist taxonomy list isn't an exact match to ours, so we have to make sure that those matches are happening correctly, because we don't want to go, oh, we think that's that, but the person who uploaded it doesn't think it's that, because then that's part of the translation thing. Whereas if you give us your data direct, you know what you're matching it to, and that's a much better way from our point of view of doing it. But we do have the option of people who have their own records in iNaturalist. It's very simple for them to download their own data and format it into our batch upload system and upload it. So that's another way around it.
That's all from me.
Awesome. I'll just check if there's any others that... what are the plans for improving data accessibility into the future? I think you touched on this a little bit, Bev, but good to finish up with that perhaps.
Yep, so we're hoping to try and get our data as a bit of a live feed into some of the services within the department. We're just doing some test runs first to see if we can get that into NatureKit. At the moment, we extract the data manually and upload it into NatureKit, but if we can get a live feed in there, it means the data could be uploaded every week. It would just every time it accessed it, it would just be live data. If that works, we would then expand it for other services so that hopefully everyone can use the one basic foundational data set and everybody's data sets would be up to date. So that's where we're heading. Yes. That
would be awesome. And yeah, such a powerful and important tool. And as you can see from Emma's presentation, the potential application for this kind of information is so useful for policy and for environmental management across the state and basically everywhere. I think we probably might start wrapping up, even though we've still got a little bit of time, but if you wanted to get in touch with either of our speakers, and a huge thanks to both Bev and Emma for coming along and presenting to us today. If you want to get in touch, obviously I've put the links in the chat, so make sure to grab those. And I'm hoping both Emma and Bev are happy to field some questions. And if some of your questions in the chat haven't been answered as well. I'll let you know our next seminar is scheduled for Monday, the 15th of April, and it's on reading riparian tree leaves, what our plants can tell us about the health of our waterways. So that should be a really good one, same time as the usual 1 to 2 p.m. And make sure that you signed up to our seminar mailing list so that you can receive the links to recording. Penny will pop that link in the chat. And just make sure you register for our mailing list so that you can stay in touch. And thanks so much, everyone, and thanks again to Bev and Emma and Penny for helping out with monitoring the chat. And looking forward to seeing everyone at our next presentation. In the email, you'll see there's a few more in the schedule as well that you can look forward to. Thank you, everyone, and have a lovely week.